Hello, and welcome to the Bridge to Revenue podcast. We're an enablement podcast dedicated to bridging silos across the org to optimize revenue enablement. I'm one of your co-hosts, Natalie Spivak.
And I'm your other co host, Charles DeRupe. So today, we're joined by someone who's had a very interesting journey into her work as a product marketing manager. Carla Losak has worked in multiple capacities during her tenure at Square for about 9 years now, which is a very long time. I have personally had the pleasure of watching her impressive work as one of Square's top salespeople in my first few years at Square. But all this entire time, she sort of helped to oversee the growth and evolution of the sales team as it sort of opened into new markets. And because of her expertise and very high involvement in the restaurants vertical, she made a fitting transition to product marketing. But in every single one of the roles that she served, she has paired very closely with internal product teams and sales enablement, to execute on new product launches for customer facing teams. So now she sits on one of the largest product teams at Square, leading product marketing for sales growth and enablement. So apart from her being a champion in her career, Carla loves a good DIY project, and she is a self-titled home improvement enthusiast. So, welcome to the show, Carla Losak. Woo!
Woo! Welcome,
Thank
Carla.
you. Thank you. Thank you. Wow, what an intro, Charles. I
I
knew that
know.
you would do something exciting. Charles always knows how to amp up a crowd. So um, it
True.
is great to be with you guys. I'm super excited to be here. And as Charles mentioned, we worked closely together for a ton of years. So happy to be part of this.
Well, we're so happy for you to be here, Carla. And to get us started talking about enablement, can you tell us a little bit about what your overall experience with enablement has been like? What's the interaction and collaboration?
Yeah. Well, it's changed a lot over the years. And I say that because, we were a very small sales org when I originally was on the sales team at Square. And when sales teams evolve, it's like more teams evolved and they get a lot bigger. At the time, like we didn't even have sales enablement. Like sales enablement was coming directly from product marketing. Then we had Charles who did everything. And now we have a huge enablement team where there's a ton of different departments and a ton of different direct responsibles. We call them DRIs. So for us, there's a lot of different roles. So my role with enablement has changed over the years, I would say good and bad. When I was on sales, we had one PMM to support the product. So even in itself, the roles and responsibilities of PMM has changed. So I was hired to just own all effing like restaurant content. So making sure that sales reps knew about the industry, they knew who the core ICP was. So thinking about our customer profiles, making sure they knew value props and competitors, and then obviously know any go-to-market launches. So any net new launches, we were making sure that we were doing trainings and all of that. Once we have all of the content, working with our enablement folks to then distribute across different channels. So trainings, so making sure new trainings for go-to-market launches, making sure that we had things uploaded for knowledge cards. So depending on what knowledge system you're using, you have somewhere where it's a reference point for reps to go in and view and see any FAQs or learn more about the product and pricing. And then, of course, new hire trainings, which I think is actually the most important piece because you're starting that foundation from the start of like what they're learning and how they're learning within the industry. So that is also like another component. And then we had enablement folks that we were working in all those different areas to make sure we're handing off the content and then it's being uploaded, it's incorporated into existing materials, and then we review it. So I would say from start to finish, it was like building a great package of content, handing it off, and then reviewing and working alongside the team. And I would say that now, because we have like a really robust enablement team, it shifted a bit. So now my role as PMM, actually our go-to-market team, we have go-to-market PMMs. they are actually owning a lot of the go-to-market launches. So they're the ones interacting with sales enablement to make sure all of the new updates are being passed over. And then sales enablement has a lot of knowledge now. Like they know more about the industry, they know more about the content that they've received from PMMs. So they're starting to curate their own content. And what's nice is that now I'm becoming more of a reviewer. So necessarily where everything was on my plate, it's nice that like I can now focus on other initiatives. And that's why my title is also grow, thinking about like growth and strategy of sales and account management, where I'm not necessarily building all of the content and managing that content hub. A lot of that is actually with enablement, and I'm being informed, notified, and then I'm a really good reviewer.
I can see how now that enablement has taken on a role with developing content too. On the one hand, that sounds really good, right? Because we only have so much bandwidth. On the other, I can see it almost getting a little bit fuzzy if it's not well defined what content product marketing owns versus enablement, or even having processes in place where, let's say, it is a piece of content that product marketing owns, like a battle card, and there's some feedback coming in from the sales team in terms of challenges, et cetera, kind of introducing that feedback loop from enablement to product marketing to help optimize or improve those types of product marketing owned content. Is any of this
With more
resonating?
content, there becomes more bad content out there, and I would say, and then I think
Ooh,
that, and
yes.
that I think is a very, it's a very fine line, and I think it's hard, especially like we're in the process right now of like migrating over systems of content knowledge. So now it's like forcing us to do an audit, which is good, but it's also uncovering a lot of content where you're like, ooh,
Yes.
we don't need this anymore. Why do we still have this? Or like, are people still using this?
Yes.
So that I think is also hard to see, but that just comes with having so many cooks in the kitchen, which sounds like a really great thing because you have more people to help out with work. But then a lot of things kind of slip through the cracks. It's just inevitable because you don't have one person owning everything.
We've had our journey of experimenting on what works, between enablement, product marketing, and it has seen like so much growth over the years. But there were a lot of bumps and misalignments across the road, and not just between me and you, but across just like organizations because we grew so quickly. So during that time, and maybe even today, what do you think is the potential source of that misalignment between the two teams in any given organization?
I think finding a source of truth and who owns that source of truth. So I think that that is something that we, again, like the misalignment, I think just comes down to like who owns what and when does that person own what. So we're going through like a racy model right now where it's like actually identifying, and it's like seems like, this isn't necessary. Why do we need to write this down of who owns what? But you do when an org gets big enough because you need to know, okay, what is my expectation? And I actually think that a big part of the misalignment goes down to like, what is my expectation of what Charles is doing? What is Charles's expectation of what I'm going to be doing? And if you start out from the start, if you have misalignment or like our expectations are in line, then that's where you get frustrated with other parties and working with cross-functional partners. So I think it's really important to, again, have that RACI model from the start, because then you know what the expectation is from every other party involved.
In our early days, even our leads did not know which responsibilities belong to whom. So we would come to the table, going in and trying to negotiate, come back to our leads, and they say, you shouldn't be owning that. The other person should be owning it, which is really tough. So, when I think about this, not only do the primary DRIs need to know their responsibilities, there must be a communication and alignment with the people who they report to fully understand what those priorities are. So the
And
earlier,
dependencies. Because I
yeah,
know that like for us, it's like, when you step into more, when I was a sales rep, I like knew you could ask me a question about anything related to a sales process or what seller feedback was, and I would know it because it was top of my nose in every single day. Then as I got further removed from being seller facing and knowing some of those objections, it was hard for me to come up with those answers to key objections like just on the spot. I had to do research. I had to interact with reps. So that also, I was dependent on working with the seller facing teams to gather a lot of those insights because to me, it wasn't just my mind, it was gathering and pooling everyone else. So I think you also in projects need to understand that, like, yes, I am the expert, but I also have to lean on other people to provide me with that information.
I definitely think the clarity there between the two teams is so important, and to do that as early as possibly, because when things begin to grow and begin to accelerate, it's a runaway train, right? And so for those of you who are listening or watching, if you're online, if you're still on the earlier stages of that, you need to build those relationships with your co-teams or collaborators towards product launches, go-to-market initiatives so early on, and start somewhere. Because I think one of the biggest fears that people have between these teams is you set a process and it's not perfect, and this isn't something that's long term, but then you end up having zero process and then
Mm.
continuously reiterating that process over time. So that's sort of been a pain point from an enabler
Well,
standpoint.
yeah, and I will say that like what we've been doing now is one, we have like recurring cadences, like we're meeting on a regular basis. So like to Charles's point, like you need to build relationships with cross-functional partners in order for a relationship to like actually be able to be successful. I think a big part of it is partnership and understanding like each other's working styles, having clear communication. If you go to another cross-functional partner and just like, hey, I need this, this, and this from you, and this is exactly what I need from you, that person might be like, well, this is unexpected. But if you have a relationship with them and you're talking to them regularly, you're updating them on what your team's initiatives are, they're updating you on what their team's initiatives are to say, hey, this is coming down the pipeline, wanted to inform you. Then when I get that list of tasks, or Charles gets that list of tasks, you're less caught off guard. So aligning, I think, earlier. So even like we finished our annual planning and thinking about like what our product roadmap is going to look like for next year. Now I had a meeting, I scheduled with enablement to say, hey, there's nothing that's an AI right now that you guys have to do, but I want to let you know that like these are our top priorities for the first half of next year. These are our top priorities for the first quarter. Here's what's happening in the second half of this year. We don't have timelines. I can't give you dates to say like this is when we need support and resources, but just letting you know that it should be on your radar is helpful in itself. And it's important to do that both ways in order for each team to work better together.
Yeah. And Carla, so I love that you're talking about this cadence that you've established and communicating early and often, because to your point, if the other team doesn't know about what the priorities are, how can they properly, raise the alarms for different initiatives that arise? So building that relationship, is there anything else that you do in addition to having that recurring cadence to help keep each other closely in the loop and aligned?
I would say also like little things like recognizing like when work has been completed. I know it sounds silly, but I
No,
received a
not at all.
kudos from someone on enablement. And like it just really went a long way. I was like, thank you so much. Like you appreciate the work that I'm doing. I appreciate the work that you're doing. And sometimes you just need to do that. Like that is part of relationship building. And it just goes outside of just, okay, let's hold these meetings. Like be human, get to know each other. You want to form relationships. I'm on this podcast now because of Charles, because we formed a relationship working together. Like that is just important. So I think thinking about outside of just like a task of like what you need to get accomplished during a meeting is also crucial.
So true. I mean, I think that um, I know I've experienced this challenge, just even collaborating with other teams like sales leadership between enablement and sales leadership. But it's a little thing, but even having Slack channels or different channels for the two teams where they can interact more smoothly, little things like that make a big difference. We kind of touched on this a little bit, but in terms of what enablement can provide to help prioritize enablement initiatives for product marketing, I know, Carla, you mentioned like just more information. Can you tell us a little bit more about what can enablement provide to make things easier?
Data, obviously, metrics, it's like that's the first and foremost thing you can see. I know that we, briefly chatted that sometimes it's hard to get data. So like don't think that you have to you need a specific metric every single time you're running a report. It's mostly just explaining the why. Okay. So for me as PMM, I work directly with our creative teams. And if it's like, hey, we really need this new asset, or like sales is requesting this top one pager for X, Y, and Z. It's like, okay, great. Like, so we can get a pulse check or what's the priority? Like, what's the why, right? Or like, how many requests are coming in? And I think oftentimes then people get flustered because they're like, oh no, like, I don't have that information. But
Right.
just getting some sort of idea so that we can help prioritize us on the creative front to say like, hey, we're running this, priming campaign or awareness campaign on the creative team. Should we drop everything and create this one pager for sales because it's a P0? Or is this something that like maybe we can scale back and do it as like a side project? So I think that just being able to provide insights into the why is the most crucial piece, than rather like looking at a percentage or a click rate.
Mm-mm. Yeah, this is huge. I know I've experienced this on the enablement side when we'd get requests from sales leaders or others within the org around enablement programs that need to be developed. And it's like, well, hang on, let's take a step back. Why? What's driving this? What's the impact on the business and the sales team? Because it's one of those things where if everything's important, nothing's important, right? And we can't do everything. So that's super important. Going back to the data and metrics, are there any specific types of data points that are helpful? I know that it probably varies depending on the initiative, but I don't know if there's any kind of recurring data points that are especially helpful.
Yeah, I think general usage. So, how often is that piece of content being used? And used in like a good or and that's where it's hard because it's like a good or a bad thing. Like, what are we missing? Like, sometimes it's easier to even survey. Like, I love getting sales reps in a room and just being like, hey, like, what are the top assets that you're using? Show me everything that you're using. Why are you using them? Um, and then you could take that information and then look at some of the metrics of like obviously click rate from sellers. So like what's the response that we're getting from our clients? Is it positive? Is it negative? And any sort of correlation? Like, can we tell? That is like really important, but also really, really, really hard to define. So I understand that, but like we have been able to get it sometimes. And like that is like the best information that we could get as PMMs is to see like, is this asset working? Yes or
Mhm.
no?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. It's always tricky with data metrics, especially when they're across different tools and you're kind of trying to look at that against the actual sales performance kind of indicators to see how those things are playing together. But
Like
that,
case studies for me. That's
Yeah.
like my biggest. It's like the wild, wild west. I'm trying to figure it out. I wish that someone could tell me that this is a successful case study
yeah.
because we had all of these number of views. And I would love to see this case study. I think the ideal state that even our creative teams would love too, and I would love this more than anything, to say this case study helped us close X
Mm,
number of deals.
Yes.
right. Right.
That seems like a very easy metric to
But
find,
it's
but
not, I know.
I wish it was. And
Yeah.
I would love more than anything for someone, if you know it out there, please let me know because I am looking for it. But I think that's That's the hardest
That
one.
was my dream. You knew how much I love those dashboards and weekly and quarterly reports. And I was getting so close to being like, this is the number of deals. These are the stages when these are being used. This is the amount of time between. And so, even those are some good questions, because what I found when it comes to content, especially with PMMs, is as an enabler, I also need to connect those dots and come to you with insights. So even if it's just like, yeah, metrics are great, I need to be like, what does this mean in terms of helping the sales team? And say, hey, Carla, looks like, we're probably going to have this really cool new addressable market because there's this sub vertical here that's just talking about these pieces of content and clicking into it. Have you considered that? So, maybe it's not just metrics, but it's giving a clearer picture of what's happening during the sale and how content is being used.
What can product marketing and enablement do to overall ensure that they're working towards the same KPIs and goals?
One, talking about what their KPIs and goals are. I know that
Yes.
seems obvious, but sometimes it's not. And
Yeah.
sometimes each team is goaled differently. When you're on separate teams, your goals are just very different. And your priorities are very different. So I think just making sure that like this is what our goals are, these are what your goals are, this is how we're going to get there. And then these are our goals, and this is how we're measuring the success of hitting those goals is also important. I
Yes,
know
absolutely.
that we have like OKRs where we have, the projects that we're working on for each quarter. You don't have to, some teams you don't have to hit 100%. Like it's usually you want to get like 75% of like what your target goals were, to be, yes, I've like completed all of my tasks. But some teams like that might not be the case. So I think just aligning there of like what is like the general goals that you're thinking about.
Yeah, 1000%. And I'd say that where I see problems a lot of times, especially in a startup or fast growing company environment, is that there actually aren't a clear set of priorities to begin with, whether it's on, the individual teams or just that top-down view from even a company level of what are we focusing on with go-to-market? What's our goal? What are our priorities? How does that get distributed across the different teams? And kind of tying in with what we talked about before, who's responsible for what, having those things clearly defined.
And having joint goals is like
Yes.
number one. Like
Yes.
when you said like what is like the general like priority and focus of alignment across go to market, it's like if sales, product, marketing, if they're not aligned and they're not on the same page, you're going after completely different things, and that's where there's a broken go to market. So
Yeah.
it's important to make sure across the board that you're also thinking about the same priorities.
Yes.
Or
Yeah.
even if it's one initiative, right? So I think,
Yeah.
advice there is like you hear that and you're like, well, how can I change a priority across all of go-to-market? You don't need to change the priority across all of
Mm,
go-to-market, right? Like that's not on you. I think for that one project that you're working on and all the cross-functionals that you're working on, how do you just make sure that you're aligned on that one project and goal? And that's like
mhm.
a step in the right direction. But there's when you have a ton of other products and a ton of other focus areas across the company, enablement is also trying to juggle all of those different goals. So that's why even if you're like aligning on like, hey, we're launching this product on the food and beverage side of things, it's going to impact all of these sellers. Can we just have a target for these sellers and this audience and this training for sales? Like, let's make sure we're aligned here. That's where it's really important, because you can't change, again, the overarching goal. And like food and beverage might not be the most important thing to enablement and sales at the time. And that's okay. But
Yeah.
I also need to know that as the expectation going into the project.
So we're getting to that part of the episode. We would love to ask you one last question. If you had a message to enablers out there, what would that message be?
I feel like I kind of touched on it in my last one is like, just be flexible,
Hmm.
be super flexible. Yeah, don't be super rigid.
Cool. Well, not being super rigid and being flexible is based on empathy, and empathy builds on better collaboration. So, with that said, thank you so much, Carla, for joining us today.
Thank you guys. This has been awesome.
It, re-
Awesome.
it really has. It's been such a pleasure getting your insights. I haven't talked to too many product marketers, so I learned a lot from you today too. So thank you for sharing. Um, Join us for the next episodes we have coming up, where we'll be talking to others across the org and having these types of open dialogues around challenges and how ultimately we can bridge those silos and really make enablement the best it can be.